for our city council. We thought it would be, as Sharice mentioned, Council Member Shekar Krishnan from Jackson Heights and Elmhurst, Queens. And I'm very excited about today's briefing because I think we're early enough in the process to really, the budget process, to make sure that we set our agenda very clearly for our parks and green spaces across the city. And of course, we have the budget hearings ahead. We'll be having public actions as well, more to come about that too. And so much more advocacy that will be happening to make sure that our parks and green spaces get the support that they need. Keep in mind, as I said, and I beat the drum on last year, alongside all of our Play Fair Coalition advocates and so many of you too, fighting for our green spaces in our city is an essential fight. These aren't luxuries or amenities. These are essential spaces that we rely on for our mental health, for our well-being, for our families, our seniors, and of course for our climate. Our parks and green spaces, our tree canopy plays a critical role in making sure that we have a New York City that's sustainable for the future and protected from climate change too. We've had briefings before on our tree canopy and the importance of it. And so I'm really excited to now have a larger briefing about our parks budget. And the work that we do this year really builds upon the historic wins that we had in last year's budget due to the intense advocacy and sustained advocacy from everyone, all of the organizations I mentioned before as part of our Play Fair Coalition. I think, know that we achieved the largest parks budget in the history of New York City in last year's budget. And that meant so much more funding for our trees to our one part of it was increasing our parks equity initiative for all of us as a council district to be able to have in each of our districts dollar for dollar money to put towards parks maintenance, park staffing, programming in our parks too. And what I was most excited and inspired about was that that was fundamentally a worker's budget. It was a budget that really converted a lot of really important positions in our parks department into permanent full-time positions. The parks system in our city depends on our parks workers. They are, as I always say, they are the beating heart of our parks. And so we've got to make sure that we are providing critically the funding to support them, the work that they do, and maintenance across our green spaces, because we can't really create and expand our green spaces without also making sure that we have the resources and funding to maintain them too. And so last year, and getting to a budget that was around, blanking now, but 620 or 630 million, it was the largest budget in the city, but we have far more work to do. Our campaign for 1% of our city's budget for our parks, we're fighting for that. All the organizations here today as part of this briefing have been fighting for that. And it's not anything radical. There's so many other cities across our country that dedicate 1% or more of their budget towards their city's parks. And so we've got a lot of work to do in catching up to that. One of the things that really struck me in our budget hearings last year was the data our Parks Committee put together, just showing over the years the steady public disinvestment in our parks over decades. And so that's, of course, led to historic and deep-seated inequities when it comes to accessing green space, right? Every New Yorker deserves access to well-maintained, high-quality green space. But districts like mine, for example, we rank 50 out of 51 council districts when it comes to green space. And what I just learned recently is with redistricting, we're actually losing a bit more green space in my council district too, which I'm very unhappy about. But it goes to show there's a lot of work that we need to do to really address these historical inequities. And that's where 1% of our budget is something that we need to really be fighting for and need to achieve. It's also something that Mayor Adams committed to during the campaign. And so it is really holding him accountable for what he said he would do for our green spaces and parks and what we expect him to do. Now, as part of that, there are things that, we've got to make sure in looking at the preliminary budget that just came out, and I was, briefed in full detail from our Parks Committee recently about it. But there are a lot of things in there that we need to actually reverse and correct, just like we did last year as well. There's funding that we put in for maintenance lines and parks workers, staff, to tree stump removal, to our urban park rangers that have been taken out that we need to fight for and make permanent lines in our city too. And so a lot of this is really reversing some of the cuts that we've seen to parks. There were vacancy positions and other positions too that have been eliminated that we need to put back in. So we're starting from a place where not only are we fighting to get to 1% of our budget, but there are crucial positions and funding lines that we achieved in our historic budget last year that in this prelim budget have been taken out. And so my view is we need to fight to put those back in, and then some on top of that too, to make sure that we are marching towards 1% of our budget for our city parks. And finally, at the end of last year, with the support of all your offices, unanimous city council, working with our Play Fair advocates, we passed historic legislation in the council to address the fundamental failures and deficiencies in our parks capital process. We all know that it takes far too long to build parks and playgrounds in the city, far too much money to build bathrooms or comfort stations in our parks. And the critical legislation, the three-piece legislation that we passed at the end of our last session in December, does a few things. One, it forces the city and city agencies to find efficiencies in the capital process and to commit to them to expedite the construction of parks and playgrounds. And on top of that, it sets clear targets of how timelines should be reduced by at least 25% when it comes to the capital process, and also requiring our city agencies to look at the different street redundancies, whether it's dead ends, whether it's highway entry and exit ramps, to make sure that we're looking at all the different ways that we can create micro parks, bioswales, and green space in our city in place that we haven't looked at before. All of these things work together to make sure that fundamentally we are marching towards a city where we have green space accessible for every single New Yorker. So much more work to do to build on that legislation this year as well. And there's much more work that we, of course, have ahead of us most immediately in fighting for a budget that truly reflects the fact of how our parks are essential spaces in our city. So I want to turn it over now to our Play Fair Coalition to continue giving you all a really informative briefing about the work ahead of us. But I want to say first and foremost, thank you to every single organization, advocate as part of this coalition. It is really you all fire me up, fire up our council, and I'm definitely fired up to keep fighting this year ahead too. So thank you all so much.
Thank you, Councilmember Krishnan. I want to continue with our introductions, and I want to turn it over to two of our Play Fair co-founder members. First, we'll start with Julie Tai of the New York League of Conservation Voters for a brief introduction.
Thanks, Charisse, and thank you, Councilman, for all that you're doing with the Parks Committee, and you really jumped right in right away. I'm president of the New York League of Conservation Voters, and as was mentioned, I'm proud to be a founding member of the Play Fair Coalition. We, of course, are urging the mayor and the council to fund our parks at 1% to further the health, resiliency, and sustainability of our city. Protecting parks is one of the league's top priorities. Every year, we slowly see the worsening effects of climate change and dangerous carbon emissions on our daily lives. And parks and other green spaces are one of the city's most valuable environmental infrastructure assets. The 2.6 million trees in our city remove 1,300 tons of pollutants from the atmosphere, and they store 1 million tons of carbon every single year. Green spaces and trees mitigate urban heat island effect by reducing temperatures by up to 9 degrees, as we saw all too starkly in the New York Times expose on this last year. Our city's parks provide clean air by filtering out pollutants, and they protect our waterways by capturing almost 2 billion gallons of stormwater runoff each year. And we know already that all communities are not benefiting equally from parks. Just as environmental justice communities suffer from higher rates of pollution and adverse health effects, they also lack access to green spaces. And we need to expand access to green spaces to underserved communities and prioritize investment in those areas to ensure that the parks that they do have are properly funded and cared for. And we need more green spaces in the neighborhoods most at risk of flooding and storm surge that can absorb that water. That's why we need to make sure we're equitably investing in our city's parks and the people who take care of them, because it is really critical that we have the staff and the workforce necessary to maintain them over time. We want to thank Councilmember Krishnan for his leadership and support, and to all of our coalition members and to all of the council's support for investing in parks and for the great strides we've made in making sure since we've begun this campaign that we are increasing the amount of investment that the city makes. I also want to point out that 2 of the bills that Councilmember Krishnan mentioned were actually included in NYLCV's 2022 City Council scorecard, and we look for parks bills every single year to be part of that. Together, again, we're asking for the mayor and the council to invest what's a small piece of our budget, 1%, into something that takes up 14% of our space and make sure that our parks are properly cared for and have a place for all to visit that benefit our air and our water quality, help us fight climate change, and help us to stay healthy. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Charisse. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. I'm going to pass it over quickly to Susan Chin from DC 37 to give a brief introduction, and then we'll start our presentation.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Council Member Krishnan, for breaking down the budget. Thank you for the staff and the council members who attended this most important briefing. I'm going into specifics as to what we are requesting from DC 37. We are proud to be one of the founding members of this Play Fair Coalition, and we're very happy to have the partnership with our fellow partners in this endeavor. So last year, the administration funded 280 positions, and they are the 100 city park workers at a cost of $10 million. So it's 100 city park workers and 50 gardeners at a cost of $10 million, 50 urban park rangers, $3 million, 80 park enforcement patrol officers at $6 million, as well as 56 green thumb forestry positions. So the administration picked up this restoration, but we were told that it's a one-time infusion that they were going to put in. So we are requesting the city council to restore it and to join us to ask the mayor to baseline these most important positions. Council Member Krishnan had mentioned how important these positions are with the maintenance in the parks. They help, there are seasonal positions as well. There's a minimum of 1,800 seasonal positions, which were federally funded, but those need to be restored as well, because many people are complaining about how dirty the parks are. And if we don't have the seasonal workers to do the work in the parks, they will continue to be dirty, and it's not attractive, and people won't want to go there, and then you'll have blight. So these are the positions that we need restored immediately. There are positions, these positions have people currently working in them, and if they're not restored, this will mean a layoff for these people as well as their families. So it's very important. But mainly, we are asking for 1% to be funded by the administration. It was a pledge by the mayor when he ran, and it would help alleviate some of these requests that we are asking for, because if we have 1%, we won't always have to come back hand in hand to ask for these positions. And they're not high-paying positions, but they are much needed positions. So in addition to what we are asking for restoration and the mayor to baseline, we would like to see an additional 100 CPWs, 50 gardeners, 50 UPRs, and 80 PEP officers at a minimum as well. But we definitely need the previously mentioned 280 positions, along with the 56 green thumb positions and the minimum of 1,800 seasonal positions. Crucial. We need them, and we're asking you to help us and to join us in the partnership to restore and get the mayor to baseline these positions in his budget. But again, we are asking for the 1% of the city's budget to be put toward funding for parks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan. I'm going to just turn it over very briefly to Adam Ganser, the Executive Director of New Yorkers for Parks, and then we'll begin our presentation.
Thanks, Charisse. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Good. I really just want to reiterate what Susan Chin from DC 37 mentioned. There are 280 positions that were funded as one-shot positions, and those positions are set to expire in June, meaning those folks are going to lose their jobs, and our park system is going to suffer for not having those positions in place. There's been sort of a long-standing history of robbing Peter to pay Paul with the Parks Department. So along with the mayor's announcement of 715 positions, new baseline positions, there have been all sorts of frozen positions that have been cut. And so we're basically at a status quo. There has been very little change in the overall headcount of the Parks Department. And headcount is the answer. We need more Parks employees to take care of our parks. With that, I'll turn it back over to Sharice and y'all can run the presentation. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. We'll start our presentation. Just briefly, a little bit about New Yorkers for Parks. We're the only citywide organization that advocates for parks quality and open spaces for all New Yorkers. We've been doing this for over 100 years, and we champion equitable development, distribution, and maintenance of New York City parks and open spaces. And briefly about our coalition, we have a coalition over 400 groups and organizations that champion New York City parks issues. We identify comprehensive solutions to these citywide problems, and we continue to advocate for increased funding for New York City parks. And our campaign is 1% for parks, as everyone knows. Our co-founders, you've met them. It's us and New Yorkers for Parks, the New York League of Conservation Voters, and DC 37. And then we're obviously supported by our great Parks Committee Chair, Shekar Krishnan. And I'm going to turn this presentation over now briefly to my colleague, Daniel Abraham, who's going to give you a little bit of background on why we need 1% for parks.
Thank you, Sharice. I am Daniel Abram, the Project Manager of Research and Policy at New Yorkers for Parks. And as you all have heard, 1% for parks remains an important goal for New Yorkers for Parks and for all New Yorkers as well. Council Member Krishnan just mentioned the importance of parks for our physical and mental health, and to not have the 30,000 acres of parkland or 700 park sites for over 8 million New Yorkers who use parks as their backyard properly funded and maintained is a policy failure. And Mayor Adams has committed to this goal, and we need to see our Parks Department sufficiently funded. Next slide. So the New York City Parks Department hasn't seen 1% or more of the city's expense budget since 1960. Since the fiscal crisis in the 1970s, the Parks Department has been forced to operate under an austerity budget, somewhere between 0.5% and 6.6%. While the 0.6%, as previously mentioned, is the highest the Parks Department has ever seen, it's partly by virtue of the citywide operating budget growing overall, as well as our advocacy efforts. Next slide. So the New York City's operating budget has grown 127% since 1980. And you can see in this slide here that all the other major agencies have grown by at least the same amount. Parks, on the other hand, has only grown by 72% in over 40 years. Next slide. This also translates to New York City lagging behind other major US cities in park spending, both as a share of the city's operating budget and per capita. As New Yorkers, we have a lot of pride, and frankly, it hurts me to see us in last place among the major US cities in parks funding. And this is something that we can change by simply moving up to 1%, and will also help us care for, again, that 30,000 acres of parkland and those 700 park sites. Next slide. The slow and low budget growth has translated to some issues in parks that could be addressed by allocating 1% of the city's operating budget to parks. We surveyed park stewards through our Play Fair survey, and they told us they're seeing increases in usership year round, including outside of the traditional busy season. More usership means a greater need for maintenance, general maintenance, including trash collection, comfort station cleanliness, maintain trees, garden beds, and lawns, and a greater need for a feeling of safety in parks as well, meaning more PEP officers and support for them. Half of park stewards said that visitors expressed safety concerns, and that's corroborated with the preliminary numbers from the mayor's January 2023 management report, showing nearly a 30% increase in crime against persons and property in the first 4 months of fiscal year 23. For all of these reasons, general maintenance, including trash collection, like I mentioned, comfort station cleanliness, maintain trees, garden beds, and lawns, 1% of the city's operating budget is not only remains relevant, but is necessary for New Yorkers. Our park system is underfunded, and we're seeing the results of that underfunding through a lack of maintenance and lower feelings of safety in parks. And we'll continue advocating for 1% for parks. And we thank you all for your support in this. Next slide. And with that, I'll pass it back over to Sharice, who will talk a little bit about where we are now with staffing in parks and how 1% of the city's operating budget will help Parks Department meet its staffing and maintenance needs.
Thank you, Daniel. As you heard from previous speakers, we secured the largest New York City parks budget in history at $624 million, surpassing the previous year's record. This historic budget represents a significant investment in parks and parks workers, as Susan from DC 37 clearly articulated. This is a huge change in direction from previous administrations, and it's inching us closer to 1% for parks. However, this investment needs a deeper and longer commitment from the council. The mayor's preliminary budget cuts back on these gains, and we need the city council to continue to champion a way forward to 1% for parks. The successes that we had that's on your screen shows that we were able to get baseline 715 positions, which are a huge win for parks workers and New York City residents by stabilizing these positions and ensuring some maintenance and operation needs are met year over year. However, during the budget negotiation, the council did not fund 280 maintenance and operation positions, as Susan and Adam mentioned. Through the administration, we were able to secure only 1 year of funding to support those positions, which will not be available again. It is critical that the council allocate funding for these 280 positions and get them baseline to deliver the critical services to our parks. Next slide. Through our collective advocacy, we won positions to provide basic services. We were able to secure over $25 million for what the council calls Play Fair positions that include urban park rangers, green thumb, PEP officers, forestry management, maintenance team, tree stump removal, and the Parks Equity Initiative that Council Member Shekar Krishnan mentioned. And that initiative supports important community engagement efforts. Next slide. As everyone is aware, there were cuts across most city agencies. Unfortunately, the New York City Parks Department suffered more than 500 eliminated positions by the Adams administration. An additional significant losses included the elimination of 1,300 cleaning corps positions that the council and mayor did not allocate funding for to maintain these critical jobs. The cleaning corps positions were funded from the federal government in 2020. And it's critical that the council and the mayor restore these positions so that our parks can get the basic services that we need. As previously mentioned, these 280 one-shot positions need to be restored through the council and be baselined. Next slide. The council is uniquely positioned to increase the department's headcount to meet our parks needs, which you can do by restoring these 280 one-shot positions that are set to expire in June, championing them to be baselined by the administration, and then equally important is funding additional Play Fair positions for staffing and programming. We are working with key nonprofit and advocacy partners, as well as the Parks Department, to quantify the number of positions and the funding that is needed to make these basic service needs, to meet these basic service needs for maintenance and operation. We'll get back to you in March with the specific numbers as we head into the budget hearings. In Mayor Adams' State of the City address, he said he is committed to increasing green spaces and identifying micro parks. While we champion this effort, the preliminary budget does not reflect this value. In order for the mayor's capital ambition, in order to support the mayor's capital ambition, the expense budget needs to be able to meet those needs. Increasing parks and open spaces means the council and the mayor needs to increase the park department's headcount to support increasing space. Next slide. Councilmember Krishnan mentions the bill, Intro 840, about fixing the capital process. This bill will require DDC to coordinate with appropriate city agencies to develop a strategic blueprint to reduce the duration of capital projects by at least 25%. You can support this by signing on to the bill and then voting to pass it. This is critical to helping us improve our park services and reducing the time of construction projects. Next slide. So I'm going to turn it over to one of our partners, Alia from the New York League of Conservation Voters, and she's going to talk to you about parks, equity, and climate.
Great, thanks, Sharice. Good afternoon. My name is Alia Sumro, and I'm the Deputy Director for New York City Policy at the New York League of Conservation Voters, a statewide environmental advocacy organization representing over 30,000 members in New York City. Next slide. Today, I'm going to connect the dots between our parks and budget advocacy with climate change and advancing equity. In addition to improving air quality and our mental health, as was outlined previously, studies have shown the benefits of parks and increased tree canopy coverage in helping to soak up carbon emissions to fight climate change. For instance, a recent study looked at vegetation across New York City and some densely populated adjoining areas has found that on many summer days, photosynthesis from trees and grasses absorb all the carbon emissions produced by cars, trucks, buses, and then some more. The result, based on hyper-local vegetation maps, points to the importance of urban greenery in our carbon cycle. Yet parks and trees are not distributed equitably due to many compounding factors such as historic residential redlining, years of disinvestment in Black and brown neighborhoods, and environmental racism. Next slide. For example, studies have shown that in more than 100 formerly redlined neighborhoods, which today remain lower income and more likely to have Black and Hispanic residents, are today 5 degrees hotter in summer compared to non-redlined areas. These formerly redlined neighborhoods have fewer trees and parks and more paved surfaces compared to non-redlined areas. Additionally, a 2020 analysis from the Trust for Public Land found that the average park size in New York City was 7.9 acres in predominantly Black neighborhoods, leaving residents with less space compared to largely white areas, where the average was 29.8 acres. The average park size is 6.4 in poor neighborhoods compared to 14 acres in wealthy neighborhoods. Through our budget advocacy, we want to ensure that funding for parks and playgrounds and increased tree canopy coverage flows equitably to address past environmental harms, as well as prepare for future climate threats. Next slide. So on top of advocating for increasing and maintaining the city's tree coverage in an equitable manner, I also wanted to highlight the important role parks and playgrounds need to have in our city's green infrastructure program. Green infrastructure can include rain gardens, green and blue roofs, permeable pavements, and subsurface detentions for temporary storage of stormwater runoff. Unlike traditional types of playgrounds and impermeable pavements that contribute to flooding and the urban heat island effect, green infrastructure sustainably manages stormwater runoff, especially as storms and extreme rainfall become more frequent and severe due to climate change. Green infrastructure improves our city's resiliency, reduces flooding during storms, and improves the environment. A great example of the connection between parks and green infrastructure was recently shown in a City Limits article, as you can see on the right side. And it highlighted a new playground in Manhattan's Chinatown that has a new porous turf field that can capture an estimated 1.3 million gallons of stormwater runoff each year that would have otherwise flooded the surrounding streets and overwhelmed our sewer system. On top of that, it also brings about 26,000 residents within a 10-minute walk of a park to a park, according to DEP. So this just shows the importance of connecting parks with green infrastructure in order to make parks more equitable and to fight climate change. Next slide. And then lastly, I just wanted to highlight the important passage of the New York State Environmental Bond Act. And we hope that the city leverages funds in the next several years. There's approximately $300 million in funding for statewide for projects concerning urban forestry, urban heat projects such as green roofs, community gardens, cool pavement projects, and projects that utilize natural and working lands to sequester carbon and mitigate methane emissions. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Alia, and thank you all for attending. We'll open it up for questions, if there's any questions. I know that a couple people have been asking about the presentation, and so we will absolutely send the presentation to everyone so that you have the PowerPoint. We'll send it as a PDF. And I see a comment from Councilmember Gail Brewer about turning schoolyards into jointly operated. A bill to turn all schoolyards into jointly operated schoolyards with the parks and DOE. And that's something that we can consider. We can talk to you about supporting that bill.
We are absolutely supportive of that Gail Brewer's office. I don't want to hedge on that one at all. That's great.
Are there any other questions? Okay, with that, we have about 20 minutes left, so I guess you can get your 20 minutes back. I want to thank you all so much for supporting our work and continuing the fight for 1% for parks. And following this presentation, we will send out the actual PDF of the presentation, and we'll be in touch with your offices as we continue to advocate for 1%. Are there any other questions or comments? All right, well, thank you so much.
Bye, everybody. Thank you for participating.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.